Okay, today's Q&A is about chocolate, and the question is, what can you tell me about how you make chocolate? So making chocolate takes a lot of expertise and skill, experience, and it starts like this. You take cocoa beans, and they roast them, and they grind them into what's called cocoa liquor. That's something, it's not alcoholic, but that's what it's called. And then the cocoa liquor is pressed so that it separates into two things. One is cocoa butter, which is not dairy, and cocoa powder. So until this point, when we start with cocoa liquor, and then we eventually hit cocoa butter and cocoa powder, there aren't any Kashrus issues for year-round or for Pesach. But once we pass this point, then things get a little bit more complicated. So cocoa butter is very expensive and a very desirable type of oil or fat, and it's what makes chocolate bars be creamy. So you have to always be sure that someone is not adulterating cocoa butter with other oils or fats that are cheaper and that could substitute for it, and you can get away with that. Also, in some countries, you're allowed to add a certain amount of glucose, which is a type of sugar, to cocoa powder without necessarily declaring it as an ingredient. And that would potentially make a Pesach issue because glucose could come from wheat or corn also. Now, if you just had these ingredients, the cocoa powder and the cocoa butter and cocoa liquor, then it wouldn't taste very good if you want to make a candy bar out of that. So usually they're mixed with sugar and milk and other things to make chocolate that we all like, kind of that you eat or that you bake with. Those other ingredients, of course, they could be kosher sensitive themselves, and also potentially that affects things even without those other ingredients because they're shared with the same equipment as these do. Now, there's a later stage called conching, which is you slowly stir the chocolate at a very low temperature for a really long time. If you want to make really good chocolate, you have to do that. Okay, now, we've been talking about what it takes to make chocolate in a factory. That's where they create the actual, the base chocolate itself. But from there, it gets sent to other people who add all kinds of other stuff to it. Anything you want to add, you make out of chocolate could be added to it. Of course, those have their own kashrus issues to deal with once we get to that points. Okay, now, the original way people use chocolate, at least in the West, was as a hot beverage, and the assumption was at that point that the bracha on it was shahakal. But then, with time, people would eat it drink it as hot chocolate. But now people started eating chocolate like a chocolate bar, and people started asking questions whether that bracha made sense to keep English haka on it. That's because there's a general rule that if the typical way you use a food is after it's ground or pureed, you don't eat it whole, you eat it always in that kind of ground up or pureed form, then the bracha should be ha'etz or hadama if it came from the ground, and not shahakal. Usually, you make shahakal on something that's pureed, but if the thing is, if they always do it, always you use this food in that form, then you make ha'etz on it. So cocoa beans are, of course, nowadays mainly good for pureeing, like to turn into chocolate bars and into cakes and things like that, to put into foods. And therefore, the logic is that the bracha should be ha'etz. And somebody, there are people who have come up with reasons as to why that might not be correct. But Rosh Zalman and others said that Lamaisa, the right bracha, so to speak, should be ha'etz. But Lamaisa, the minig of the world, he mentions this himself, that the minig is to recite shahakal, and in fact, that's what people do.